I'm 89 years old and dementia is stealing my memories. But before I forget, I need to tell you about the 47 years I spent hiding the last Bigfoot on Earth, and why his death means we lost more than just a species. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell me where you're watching this story from. I'm 89 years old now, and for 47 years I've been keeping a secret that defied everything science believed about human evolution, language, and consciousness. But the dementia that's beginning to steal my memories is forcing me to speak before this truth disappears forever. My name is Dr. Margaret Chen, and on June 15, 1978, when I was just 42 years old, a Lummi elder named Thomas Whitefeather led me into a remote cave in the Cascade Mountains, and I met someone who wasn't supposed to exist. This is the story of how a skeptical academic became guardian to the last representative of a sister species to humanity, and why I've finally decided to reveal what I protected for nearly half a century. I tell you this from my living room in Bellingham, Washington, surrounded by artifacts most people would find unremarkable: carved wooden bowls, faded photographs, a collection of charcoal drawings on weathered boards. But I know what each item represents. The small cedar box on my mantel holds ashes that no forensic scientist will ever analyze. The drawings stacked in archival boxes in my closet depict a world seen through eyes that were almost, but not quite, human. My hands shake as I speak, not just from age, but from the weight of carrying this truth alone for so long. Some might call me crazy. Others will demand proof I'll never provide. But I know what I protected, what I loved, and what I lost. And before my mind fails completely, before the fog that's already creeping in erases these memories like morning mist burning off the mountains, the world needs to know that we were never alone. That intelligence and consciousness don't belong exclusively to Homo sapiens. That I spent 47 years as mother, friend, and guardian to someone named Cole, who changed everything I thought I knew about what it means to be a person. June 15, 1978. Jimmy Carter was president. "Stayin' Alive" by the Bee Gees played on every radio. The country was still reeling from Watergate, still processing the end of Vietnam. And I was living alone in a research cabin 50 miles east of Bellingham, deep in the temperate rainforest of the North Cascades. The cabin belonged to the University of Washington's anthropology department, accessible only by a dirt road that became impassable in winter. It was perfect for my work, cataloging Lummi artifacts, interviewing tribal elders about oral traditions that most academics dismissed as mere folklore. I was a widow then, 3 years since losing my husband David in a climbing accident on these very mountains. At 42, I'd thrown myself into work, preferring the silence of ancient forests to the company of colleagues who considered my research excessively romantic about dying cultures. I lived simply. A wood stove for heat, kerosene lamps for light, a hand-crank radio for news. My nearest neighbor was 8 miles away. I spent my days with dusty artifacts and even dustier books, my evenings writing field notes by lamplight. The isolation suited me, or so I told myself. What I didn't know was that Thomas Whitefeather, an 87-year-old Lummi elder I'd been interviewing for 6 months, was about to entrust me with something no white academic had ever been told. A secret his people had guarded for generations, a truth that would consume the rest of my life. The morning of June 15th arrived with an unnatural silence. I noticed it immediately when I woke at 5:15 a.m. No bird song, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, not even wind through the Douglas firs that surrounded my cabin. The forest held its breath. I was making coffee when Thomas knocked on my door at exactly 5:37 a.m. I know the time because I checked my watch, surprised that he'd come so early and unannounced. He stood on my porch carrying a ceremonial staff I'd never seen him use, wearing traditional cedar bark clothing instead of his usual jeans and flannel shirt. "Today you meet the Tsiatko," he said simply, using the Lummi word I knew from legends. The wild man of the forest, the untamed one. I assumed he was taking me to a sacred site, perhaps cave paintings or an ancestral burial ground. I grabbed my field kit, notebook, camera, measuring tape, basic first aid supplies, and followed him into the forest. We hiked for 6 hours. Thomas moved with surprising agility for his age, following trails I didn't know existed despite my years in these mountains. We climbed higher than I'd ever gone in this area, ascending to elevations where snow still patched the ground in mid-June. The temperature dropped, and my breath misted in the thin air. At the base of a granite cliff split by a narrow fissure, Thomas stopped. He pointed at the ground. I looked down and felt my scientific worldview crack. Footprints, human-shaped, but 17 inches long, pressed deep into the mud near a small stream. 5 distinct toes, a broad heel, no claw marks. The stride length was at least 6 feet between steps. Whatever made these tracks weighed significantly more than any human, walked upright on 2 legs, and had passed through here recently. The edges of the prints were still sharp, not yet eroded by weather. "Inside," Thomas said, gesturing toward the fissure in the cliff face. The opening was narrow, barely wide enough for my shoulders. I had to turn sideways to squeeze through, my field kit scraping against rock. The passage opened into a cave maybe 20 feet deep and 12 feet wide. Thomas's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, and there, hunched in the far corner, was someone I couldn't explain. A male figure, approximately 8 feet tall, even crouched low, covered in reddish-brown hair that caught the flashlight beam like burnished copper. The face that turned toward us was simultaneously simian and profoundly human. Pronounced brow ridge, broad flat nose, strong jaw. But the eyes, God, the eyes were what stopped me cold. Deep-set golden brown, they fixed on me with unmistakable intelligence and palpable terror. Not animal awareness, human-level consciousness staring back at me through a face that evolution had shaped differently than mine. My scientific training warred with my senses. This couldn't exist. Gigantopithecus was extinct. No great ape species survived in North America. Sasquatch was folklore, wishful thinking, misidentified bears and hoaxes. But folklore doesn't bleed. And this being was badly injured. His left leg had a compound fracture, white bone visible through a suppurating wound that oozed yellow pus mixed with blood. The leg was swollen to perhaps twice its normal size, the skin around the break an angry purple-black. He trembled with fever, his massive chest heaving with labored breathing. The smell hit me then. Infection, sharp and sour, mixed with a musky animal odor that reminded me of wet dog but earthier, wilder. Thomas spoke softly and lummy, words I didn't fully understand but whose meaning was clear from his tone. He was introducing me, asking this being to trust. The creature, no, I realized immediately, not creature, the person, because those eyes held the same desperate plea I'd seen in David's eyes as he fell, the same conscious awareness of mortality, the same hope that another being might choose mercy over fear. He tried to shift position and cried out, a sound halfway between human and something deeper, more primal. His right hand, and it was a hand, 5 fingers with thick nails that were distinctly not claws, reached toward the injured leg, then pulled back, as if he'd learned that touching it only increased the pain. I faced an impossible choice in that moment. If I helped, I risked my career, my freedom, possibly my sanity. I'd be protecting something that, if discovered, would be hunted, captured, dissected by researchers who'd see only a specimen, not a person. If I walked away or reported this, I'd condemn to death a being clearly capable of suffering, capable of fear, capable of hoping for help. I thought of David, of how I'd been unable to save him, of how helplessness had haunted me for 3 years. Without words, I opened my field kit. Over the next 8 weeks, I made that 6-hour hike 17 times. I carried veterinary antibiotics obtained from a friend at the university under the pretense of treating injured wildlife. I brought splints, clean water, food. Each visit was a negotiation of trust. Initially, he growled warnings whenever I approached, his lips pulling back to reveal teeth that were more human than gorilla. No pronounced canines, molars designed for varied diet. I moved slowly, speaking in calm tones, showing my hands were empty of weapons. "I'm going to help you," I said, knowing he couldn't understand the words but hoping he'd recognize the intent. "I know you're in pain. I'm going to try to make it better." The first time I touched him to clean the wound, his entire body went rigid. But he didn't strike at me. He watched my hands with intense focus, tracking every movement as I cleaned away pus and dead tissue, applied antibiotic ointment, wrapped clean bandages around the leg. Communication began primitively. I'd tap my chest and say, "Margaret," repeat it, point at myself and say my name over and over. By the third week, he responded by tapping his own massive chest and producing a sound, Om Tha Ka, a deep vocalization his anatomy could shape, but that wasn't quite human speech. I started calling him Cole, short for the Lummi word Kolshet, which Thomas said meant grandfather, or ancient one. By the end of the second month, Cole allowed me to touch the wound without flinching. He began imitating my gestures, pointing at objects he wanted, shaking his head when I offered food he didn't like. The intelligence was undeniable. He learned to recognize about 40 English words without speaking them, responding appropriately when I asked, "Are you hungry?" or "Does this hurt?" But what truly convinced me I was dealing with a person, not an animal, was the art. Cole drew. Using charcoal from the fire Thomas had taught him to maintain, he traced images on the cave walls with surprising delicacy given his massive hands. He drew deer with anatomically accurate proportions, bears catching salmon, trees in different seasons, and people, stick-figure humans that were clearly meant to represent Thomas and me, identifiable by our relative heights and the objects we carried. One drawing made my breath catch. It showed a larger figure lying down, a smaller figure bending over it, and lines radiating from the interaction that I interpreted as help or healing. Cole had created a pictograph of our relationship. "You're not an animal," I whispered one evening in late July, watching him carefully arrange berries and nuts I'd brought into separate piles by type. "You're a person, a different kind of person, but a person." Cole looked up at my voice, made a soft rumbling sound I'd learned meant contentment or agreement, pointed at himself, then at me, then made a gesture pressing both hands to his chest. Together. Us. The decision to move him to my property came in October 1978, when a documentary crew arrived in the region to film evidence of Bigfoot after tracks were found just 9 miles from the cave. Thomas brought the news with fear in his ancient eyes. "Hunters," he said, offering money, $50,000 for proof, $100,000 for a body. I thought of Cole, his leg finally healing, beginning to put weight on it again. Thought of him being shot, stuffed, displayed in a museum, or worse, captured alive, locked in a cage, studied like a lab rat until he died of despair. "We move him," I said, "to my land. I used David's life insurance money to buy the cabin and surrounding 60 acres. Told the university I was taking a sabbatical to process grief. Spent 3 months building what I described to the contractor as a root cellar and storage shed. Actually a climate-controlled underground shelter accessed through a hidden door in what appeared to be a woodshed. The transfer took place over 2 nights in January 1979, during a snowstorm that provided cover. Thomas, his grandson James, then 11 years old and sworn to secrecy, and I guided Cole through the forest, a journey of 14 miles that we covered in darkness. Cole, still favoring his injured leg, moved with remarkable silence for his size. When we finally reached my property and I showed him the shelter I'd built, insulated walls, a proper bed, a wood stove, a toilet I'd taught him to use, Cole made a sound I'd never heard before, something between a sigh and a sob. He touched the walls, the bed, turned to me and pressed his forehead to mine, a gesture of trust so profound I felt tears running down my face. "You're safe now," I whispered. "I promise." "You're safe." What I didn't know then was that I'd just committed to a 45-year deception that would consume my entire life. The 1980s brought both routine and constant vigilance. Cole and I developed a sophisticated communication system based on modified sign language. Broad gestures his large hands could shape, combined with drawings he made on wooden boards I provided. He learned to sign hungry, thirsty, cold, pain, happy. I learned his vocalizations, the low rumble that meant contentment, the sharp bark that signaled alarm, the questioning tone that meant he didn't understand something. Cole had surprising preferences that emerged as we lived together. He loved honey above all foods. I bought it by the gallon from local beekeepers, claiming I used it for mead. He was fascinated by music, especially piano. I'd play Debussy on a battery-powered tape player, and Cole would sit utterly still, his eyes closed, moving his head slightly to the rhythm. He showed genuine disgust for raw meat, refusing it when I first offered, but would eat it cooked. He'd learned somehow to prefer food prepared with fire. The domestic moments were surprisingly tender. Sunday afternoons when I'd read aloud to him, he couldn't understand the words, but seemed to enjoy the sound of my voice. Evenings when he'd weave small baskets from grass and flexible willow branches, a skill Thomas confirmed was mentioned in old Lummi legends. One December night in 1983, during the first snowfall Cole witnessed outside the cave, he pressed his face to the basement window like a child seeing magic. I couldn't resist. At 3 a.m., I opened the back door and let him experience snow. We stood together in the backyard for 20 minutes, Cole catching flakes in his palms, his eyes full of wonder, while I watched nervously for any sign of neighbors or passing cars on the distant road. But the threats never stopped. In March 1985, hunters camped less than a mile from my property for 3 weeks, claiming they'd heard inhuman screams. I had to keep Cole confined to the underground shelter for 22 days straight, bringing him meals in darkness, watching him pace with growing agitation. "I'm sorry," I told him on the 15th day, watching him stand at the shelter entrance, clearly desperate for fresh air and open space. "Just a little longer. They'll leave soon." Cole looked at me with eyes that held understanding but also a growing sadness. He signed outside and "please," then touched my face with one massive finger, gentle as a whisper. He knew I was trying to protect him, but he also understood the price of that protection. In 1992, a real estate developer purchased land adjacent to mine and began clear-cutting for a housing development. The screech of chainsaws echoed through the forest from dawn to dusk. I built higher fences, planted dense rows of Douglas fir and western cedar as a visual barrier, installed motion sensors around my property. Cole stood at the edge of our land one evening, watching the destruction in the distance. He pointed at the fallen trees, then at himself, then made a gesture sweeping across the horizon. His people used to live there. Now they were gone. The forest was dying, and with it, any chance that others like him survived. The arrival of the internet era in the early 2000s brought new terrors. Google Earth launched in 2005, and suddenly anyone could view aerial photos of properties with increasing resolution. I hacked my own digital footprint, strategically planting trees and building structures that made it impossible to see the true layout of my land. I covered the shelter's roof with solar panels that served dual purpose, power and camouflage from thermal imaging. By 2008, I'd turned down 3 tenure-track positions, published just enough to maintain academic credibility while working from home, and invented an elaborate fiction about my personal life. I told colleagues I traveled frequently to tribal reservations. I claimed to have a long-distance relationship with a fellow researcher to explain why no one ever met my partner. I pushed away anyone who wanted to get too close. My life became a lie wrapped around a truth I couldn't share. And Cole paid the price in isolation. Sometimes I'd find him sitting in the shelter at dawn, his back to the wall, staring at nothing. On those days, he wouldn't eat, wouldn't engage, just sat with a sadness that radiated from him like heat from a stone. "I'm sorry," I'd tell him, signing the words we'd developed for apology and regret. "I wish I could give you more. I wish you could be free." Cole would look at me with those golden eyes and sign back. "Safe. Together. Family." It broke my heart every time, because he was choosing to accept captivity rather than risk the alternative. And we both knew what that alternative would be. The years accumulated. The 1990s became the 2000s. Technology advanced. The world got smaller, more connected, more surveilled. And Cole got older. By 2010, silver had begun threading through his reddish fur, especially around his muzzle and chest. He moved more stiffly in the mornings, his injured leg bothering him more in cold weather. I bought glucosamine supplements from the veterinary supply store, ground them into his food. They helped, but couldn't stop time. I was aging too. At 74, I needed reading glasses. My knees protested stairs. My hands trembled when I tried to write field notes. We were two old souls growing older together, bound by a secret that isolated us from our respective species. The decision to expand the circle of trust came in 2003, born of desperation. Cole developed pneumonia that October, a deep, wet cough that shook his entire frame. His fever spiked to 105 degrees Fahrenheit. I tried every antibiotic I had, but after 3 days, he was worse. Breathing in shallow gasps, barely conscious, skin hot to the touch. I called my niece, Dr. Lisa Chen. Lisa was 38, an emergency medicine physician in Seattle, daughter of my younger brother. We'd always been close. She was the only family who visited regularly, who didn't judge my isolation. "I need help," I told her on the phone, my voice breaking. "And Lisa, what I'm about to tell you, you'll think I've lost my mind. But I need you to trust me." She arrived 6 hours later. When I led her down to the shelter and she saw Cole lying on the bed, struggling to breathe, she froze, completely still for what felt like hours but was probably 3 minutes. Then her medical training took over. "Okay," she said, her voice shaking but steady. "Okay, I need to examine him." "Can he understand that I'm trying to help?" I signed to Cole, explaining. He was too weak to respond beyond a slight nod. Lisa spent 2 days at my house, administered IV antibiotics, monitored vitals, listened to his lungs with a stethoscope, her face carefully neutral as she processed what she was doing. On the second evening, Cole's fever finally broke. He opened his eyes, focused on Lisa with those intelligent golden eyes, and slowly, carefully, pressed his hand over his heart, and then extended it toward her. The gesture I'd taught him for "thank you." Lisa's professional mask cracked. Tears ran down her face as she placed her hand over her own heart and repeated the gesture. "He's a person," she whispered. "My God, Margaret, he's a person." "Yes," I said simply, "and he needs us to keep him safe." Lisa became Cole's unofficial physician, visiting monthly for checkups. Her medical equipment stayed in a locked cabinet in my garage. She never told anyone, not even her husband, what she did on those monthly trips to visit Aunt Margaret. The circle expanded once more in 2007, when Thomas Whitefeather, knowing he was dying at 96, revealed the secret to his grandson, James. James was 32 then, a conservation biologist working for the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. He'd been sworn to secrecy as a child, but had thought the stories were metaphorical, not literal. When James met Cole for the first time since childhood, he sat down on the floor of the shelter and wept. "My grandfather told the truth," he said in Lummi, then in English. "You're real. You're actually real." Cole, who hadn't seen Thomas in years, made a keening sound of grief. Thomas had died the month before, and Cole seemed to understand what James's presence without Thomas meant. They sat together for an hour, James and Cole, mourning the elder who'd connected them. It was James who later helped Margaret understand that in Lummi tradition, Cole's people weren't monsters or curiosities. They were neighbors, kin, part of the sacred family of beings that shared the forest. 3 of us now guarded the secret. 3 humans protecting 1 person from the rest of humanity. The maximum crisis arrived in March 2024. A group of cryptozoologists equipped with the latest thermal imaging drones launched what they called a systematic scientific expedition through the North Cascades. They publicized their work online, claimed to have definitive evidence of Sasquatch in this specific region, crowdfunded $200,000 for high-tech equipment. Cole was 70 years old by my estimates, suffering from severe arthritis and a heart condition Lisa monitored with growing concern. He tired easily, slept most of the day, moved with careful deliberation. On March 12, 2024, a drone flew over my property. I was outside hanging laundry when I heard it, that distinctive whine of commercial drone motors. I looked up and saw it hovering maybe 200 feet above my land, moving in a grid pattern. Thermal imaging. They were looking for heat signatures. I dropped the laundry and ran inside. Cole was in the shelter, but the solar panels might not be enough to mask his heat if the imaging was sophisticated enough. "Stay down," I told him, signing frantically. "Don't move. Don't make noise." Cole understood immediately. He'd lived 45 years in hiding. He knew the drill. The drone passed over 3 more times that day. I filed a complaint with the sheriff about invasion of privacy, but the cryptozoologists had permits for aerial surveys of public lands, and the sheriff couldn't do much about occasional drift over private property. 2 nights later, the real nightmare began. I woke at 2:37 a.m. to motion sensor alerts. 2 figures were moving through my property, staying in tree cover, approaching the shelter. Through the security camera I'd installed, I saw them carrying thermal imaging equipment. I grabbed my shotgun, something I'd bought years ago but never imagined using, and confronted them 50 yards from the shelter. "This is private property," I said, my voice shaking with adrenaline and terror. "Leave now or I call the police." One of them, a man maybe 35 years old with expensive hiking gear and a GoPro strapped to his chest, held up his hands. "Dr. Chen, we mean no disrespect, but we have readings indicating anomalous heat signatures on your land. Large mammal, possibly primate. We just want to document. There's nothing here but deer and an old woman who values her privacy," I interrupted. "You have 10 seconds to leave before I shoot you for trespassing and call the sheriff." I'd never pointed a gun at another human being. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold it steady, but something in my eyes must have convinced them I was serious. They left, but they came back. 3 more times over the next week, each time pushing closer to the shelter. I slept in 2-hour shifts, monitoring cameras, my phone ready to call police. Finally, James used his connections at Fish and Wildlife to have the area temporarily designated as protected habitat for northern spotted owl nesting sites. It was bureaucratic maneuvering, possibly illegal, but it worked. The cryptozoologists were forced to leave. The crisis had passed, but the damage was done. Cole's health, already declining, deteriorated rapidly. The stress had triggered a cardiac event. Lisa came immediately when I called, ran an EKG using portable equipment, her face grave as she reviewed the results. "His heart is failing," she said quietly, after Cole had fallen asleep. "Margaret, I don't think he has long." I'd known it was coming, had been preparing for it for years, but hearing the words still felt like a physical blow. The final months were both beautiful and heartbreaking. Cole slept more and more, his massive chest rising and falling with labored breathing. He ate less, though he still brightened when I brought him honey. His drawings, which he'd continued making for 45 years, became tremulous and incomplete. But he was still there, still present, still Cole. We spent hours together in comfortable silence. I'd read to him from books he couldn't understand, and he'd rest his hand on my knee, a gesture that said, "I'm here. You're not alone." Sometimes I'd play his favorite Debussy pieces, and his eyes would close, a small smile pulling at his lips. Music was one of the few joys he could still experience fully. In late July, Cole did something he hadn't done in years. He drew a new picture. It showed 2 figures, one large, one small, standing together under trees. Above them, he'd drawn what looked like stars or lights in the sky. He pointed at the drawing, then at me, then at himself. Then he made a gesture upward toward something beyond. "Together," I said, understanding. "Even after. We'll still be together." Cole rumbled his agreement and touched my face with infinite gentleness. August 14th, 2025. 47 years and 2 months after our first meeting. I woke at 4 a.m. with a certainty I couldn't explain. I went down to the shelter and found Cole awake, sitting up in bed, looking at me with complete clarity. I sat beside him, took his hand in both of mine. We stayed like that for 3 hours. I talked to him about everything, about the day we met, about Thomas, about all the years we'd shared, about how he'd changed my understanding of what it meant to be a person, about how loving him had been the greatest privilege of my life. At 7:15 a.m., as dawn light began filtering through the high window, Cole made one final gesture. He pointed at my chest, at my heart, then he pointed up toward the sky. The gesture he'd made occasionally over the years, the one I interpreted as reunion or continuation. "Yes," I whispered. "I believe that too. We'll meet again." Cole's eyes held mine. He squeezed my hand once, gently, made that soft rumbling sound of contentment I'd heard thousands of times. Then his breathing slowed, became shallow, stopped. I sat there holding his hand for an hour after he passed, talking to him, thanking him, telling him I loved him. When Lisa and James arrived, I'd called them the day before, knowing this was coming. We prepared him for cremation according to Lummi tradition that Thomas had taught us. We built a ceremonial pyre on my land that night, far from any roads or neighbors. Fed the fire through the night as Cole's body became ash and smoke rising toward the stars. I gathered his remains in a cedar urn he'd carved years before, decorated with mountains and trees. Everything else, his drawings, his baskets, the wooden boards where he'd communicated with me for decades, I archived carefully. Evidence I would never share, but couldn't bear to destroy. The silence that followed was absolute. For 45 years, my home had echoed with Cole's presence, his heavy footsteps, his rumbling vocalizations, the rustle of his movements. Now there was nothing. I finally allowed myself to grieve, not just for Cole, but for everything the secret had cost, the isolation, the lies, the life unlived because I'd chosen to protect him. But I'd make the same choice again, without hesitation. Now at 89, with dementia beginning to steal my clarity, I hold Cole's ashes and centuries of drawings, and I know that an entire species likely went extinct with him. The decision to finally tell this story comes from fear. Fear that in a few years, I won't be capable of coherent testimony. Already I forget words, repeat stories, lose track of time. The doctors say I have maybe 2 years before the decline becomes severe. What I learned in those 47 years is this: intelligence and consciousness don't belong exclusively to Homo sapiens. Kinship transcends genetics and physical appearance completely. And modern humanity is so obsessed with dominating and categorizing that we destroy the extraordinary simply to catalog it. The greed that drives habitat destruction, the scientific arrogance that prioritizes discovery over ethics, the fear of the different that transforms wonder into threat. Cole exposed all of this simply by existing. He wasn't a legendary creature or evolutionary missing link. He was a person, an elder with preferences, memories, creativity, and capacity for love. He had favorite foods and music. He created art. He mourned loss. He experienced joy and fear and affection. If I could go back, I'd do it all again without hesitation. Knowing Cole was the greatest privilege of my life, even though it cost me everything else. My legacy isn't the scientific proof I could have delivered to the world. It's the lived evidence that respect for conscious life must supersede scientific curiosity, that some truths are too sacred for public exposure. And maybe, in the depths of the last untouched forests, others like Cole still exist. If they do, the best thing humanity could do is leave them alone. Let them live in peace, in the wild places we haven't yet destroyed. Don't hunt them. Don't study them. Don't discover them. Just let them be. I keep Cole's ashes on my mantle. Sometimes on quiet evenings when the fog rolls in from the mountains and the forest grows still, I swear I can feel him near. Not a ghost, but a presence. A reminder that for 47 years I shared my life with someone extraordinary. The drawings are here in archival boxes, hundreds of them spanning 4.5 decades. They chart our relationship, early crude attempts at communication evolving into sophisticated artistic expression. The last drawing he made, two figures together under the stars, sits framed beside my chair. When I'm gone, when the dementia finally takes me, Lisa and James will inherit this truth. They'll decide what to do with it. Maybe they'll burn everything, let the secret die with me. Maybe they'll find a way to tell it that protects any others who might remain. But I needed to speak it at least once, to bear witness while I still can. I'm 89 years old. For 47 years I kept the biggest secret in anthropological history. I hid a living representative of a sister species, protected him, loved him, and lost him. And I'd do it all again, because some secrets are kept not from shame but from love. Some friendships transcend species entirely. And sometimes the most important thing an academic can do is recognize that the extraordinary deserves protection, not publication. Cole taught me that we're not alone in consciousness, that intelligence takes forms we don't expect, that personhood isn't defined by DNA or appearance, but by the capacity to think, feel, create, and love. He taught me that the biggest mystery isn't whether other intelligent species exist. It's whether we humans have the wisdom to coexist with them without destroying them. I like to think I learned that lesson. I hope I honored him properly. And on quiet nights, when I look at his ashes and his drawings and feel the weight of these memories before they slip away forever, I know one thing with absolute certainty. Cole was real. He was a person. He deserved every moment of protection I gave him. And wherever he is now, whatever lies beyond this life, I hope he knows he was seen. He was known, and he was deeply, profoundly loved. That's all any of us really want, isn't it? To matter to someone, to be understood, to be cherished for exactly what we are. Cole was all of that to me, and I hope somehow I was that for him too.